Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Outliers YouTube channel and our program Get to Know. I'm your host, DP Lyle, and I am here with my partner in crime, Kathleen Antrim.
Thanks, Doug. It's very exciting to be here. We've got a fabulous new author that we want to introduce you to. She's actually just released her second book. She's award-winning and best-selling. Christa Carmen, welcome to Get to Know.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very happy to be here.
We're excited to have you and learn more about you. And as most of our viewers know, I love to start with childhood. I'm very interested to know if you feel that your childhood contributed to you becoming a writer, if it contributed to you write, what you do write about, and things like, did you have any imaginary friends, etc. So talk to us.
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. So I definitely think, my mother read tons of books to my sister and I remember, being a kid and just getting into the bed in the evenings with her and my sister and just reading book after book after book after book. And I, was a huge fan of being read to as a kid. And then as soon as I learned how to read, I was just, my family actually jokes that um, this speaks to like both my love of books and also my like slightly type A personality, that like one of my favorite pastimes was taking all of my children's books and lining them up across the room where like the corners were perfectly, lined up with one another, and then going through and like reading them all. Um, and then yeah, once I got a little bit older and I was reading more like middle grade books, I did, looking back, it's pretty easy to see that I started to be skewed. My interests started to skew more toward kind of the dark and the creepy. Like all of my most beloved reads at that time were, the James and Deborah Howe Bunnicula series, the Goosebumps series, even like, well, Nancy Drew for sure, but then even like the Boxcar Children and the Babysitter's Club books. The ones that I always loved the most were like the creepier ones, like where they're solving, some sort of ghostly crime or seemingly supernatural mysteries. So yeah, I just always kind of liked things that had some high stakes.
Did you have imaginary friends by chance?
I didn't, and I definitely didn't, and my sister didn't either. It's funny because my sister and I both have kids now, and my daughter is very much, probably even more so than I was, like very into the spooky and like again, stories with stakes. Like she'll read and listen to anything, but she likes it the best when it's like good versus evil and there's villains. And then my sister's little boy has an imaginary friend right now that we're all like very intrigued by. We're like, what did he do? What is it? Because he says some creepy stuff. So it's very fun to listen to these stories. But yeah, I did
My,
not have an imaginary friend. I think I put a lot of like I anthropomorphized my pets a lot. So I think like I basically pretended to have much richer relationships with my dog and cat than I think they were on the same page with.
so how old were you when you started thinking about actually becoming a writer as a profession?
So, interestingly enough, I think I wanted to be a writer when I was young. And then the older that I got, like from middle school on, I kind of lost my way with that. And it kind of just fell by the wayside, and I had other interests. And I was really into sports and gymnastics as a, middle and high school aged person. And then I did gymnastics in college. So all of my like outside passion away from school kind of went into that. And sadly, I wasn't, there wasn't really any part of my curriculum that would have redirected me towards being an author. I loved my English classes. But once you started thinking about careers, I was like, do I want to be a lawyer? Do I want to work in finance? Like that whole aspect of being an author fell away from me. And then when it was about 11 years ago now, that I was just kind of at like a crossroads in my life. Like a lot of like just stuff had happened. I, left Boston, moved back to my hometown, just, was changing careers. And I was sitting on a train after like a family event, coming back on the train, looking for something to read. And I ended up downloading to my Kindle Stephen King's On Writing, which was like kind of a weird choice because I owned the book back at home. Like I owned the hard copy and I had read it before. But for some reason, I just ended up reading it like almost from start to finish on this train ride. And by the time I finished it, I was sitting there like, and it sounds like kind of dumb, but it really was an epiphany where I was just like, how did I forget that I could be an author, a writer? It was like the concept of it had like exited my awareness for a decade, if not more. And I just being the kind of like obsessive the person that wanted to go home and line all their books up and get them, perfectly in order. I immediately went home and like bought a notebook and a bunch of pens and got into this, I hand wrote everything to start, and I had a very strict 4-page a day schedule, and I started reading a lot more and reading a lot more short fiction because I thought that was a good way to get into it. And yeah, I just like took off running and started writing a ton of short fiction and had finished the manuscript of my first novel, like that I ever wrote, not the first novel that I published, but yeah, finished the manuscript in, I don't know, I want to say like 4 or 5 months, maybe 6 months.
And that's pretty
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the short fiction. Um, I came in it the other way. I'd written, 20 something novels before I started writing short stories. But I think everybody should start, especially when you're first getting out. A novel is a huge undertaking and it's not easy. There's a lot of balls to keep in the air. And it's a year, especially when you're starting. Um, I think short stories is a great way to jump into it. And so you found that going with the shorter form kind of led you to the longer form. Is that safe to say?
Yeah, absolutely. For just, speaking for myself, I am so glad that I didn't, and I did write that first novel. And I think I had, enough awareness to know that, it was definitely that like first novel that you want to trunk. Like it had some, some merit to it. There was some stuff that,
Right.
I see that I do even today in my novels that are published. Like there was some stuff to, not to throw out the baby with the bathwater kind of thing. Like there were some solid things I had going on for me, but there was a whole bunch more that was not working and that I needed
Yeah.
to learn as I went. And yeah, for me, just the short stories, I found that it was so much easier to work out all of the early writer kinks in the short form.
Mhm.
Everything from, utility of language to characterization to motivation of those characters to a really solid narrative arc. I just felt like short fiction
Mhm.
gave me a crash course in being a writer on a larger scale.
It sure focuses you because a short story is about one event basically, whereas a novel is about a bunch of events,
Yeah,
that are
yeah.
causality related. But that's what I like about short fiction. I like to read it and I like to write it more now than I ever thought I would. Pretty
Yeah.
cool. Good to hear
It's a
that.
great training ground for sure. Well, tell us about your process. Are you an outliner? Are you a pantser? What's your process?
Yeah, I think what I'm discovering, I mean, I have more or less a process, but one of the things that I've always tried to remember across various aspects of being a writer is that not everything works for everybody and not everything works for me every time. And I've gotten into situations where I've sort of beat myself up for not getting something done in a certain way, and I've had to just let it go and just be like, well, for this project, that's not going to work this time. Like it stinks, but that's just the case. So for example, I try not to put a huge amount. I think the short fiction doing that first, I trust my intuition a lot. Like I trust, where when I would come up with an idea and a concept for a short piece, I would just kind of sit down and let that concept guide me and not overthink it too much. And then I found that with novels, that wasn't necessarily the case. There needed to be a bit more forethought, and at least, I don't outline. I kind of just like have a big picture plan in my head, and like these are the narrative beats I want to hit. End goals are really important to me. Like, what do I want to say with this novel? Where do I want the characters to end up? And then how I get them there kind of works its way out. But even with that being said, like, so I have a third novel coming out in October of 2025, and it was so difficult for me to write. Like, the process just was not anything like the previous two. And I was having a lot of trouble generating just the first draft, trying to pump out the words. I do best when I get a first draft out as quickly as possible and then can finesse over editing. And I just could not get the first draft out in a timely manner. Like, and I was beating myself up over it. Like, you know, in a way, I was like chastising myself for like being late. Like, you didn't hit your 12. My word count tends to be my target. If I'm working on a first draft, on a work in progress, I try to hit like 1,200 words a day just to keep myself fully in the project. And I was like, you're not hitting your word count. Like, this process has been going on forever. And then I just had to sit back and be like, you know what? This story is much more complex in terms of like multiple plot points that have to fit together. Like, give yourself a break, let it breathe a little bit. I spent like one whole evening with like, I stole a bunch of easel paper and markers from my daughter's playroom, and just like stayed up until 2 a.m. and like did all this big picture, and not outlining, but sort of like graphing. Like, these are the things that are happening. These are like the characters and where their emotions are at. And it really helped like get me back on track. And yeah, before I would have been like, you're not going to waste your time doing something like that. Like, stick to the word count, just get the first draft out. So oops, sorry about that. My dog has entered the building. She just pushed the door open. So
No problem.
but yeah, so I just try to remember that not every project is the same, and just kind of like meeting myself where I'm at.
That's fabulous insight. I like that.
It
Yeah.
really is. Yeah.
It's so easy, I feel like, too, with social media. It's such a platform for writers to share, and that can be really helpful sometimes. But especially when I was starting out, like, I would see these writers that I wanted to emulate and that I admired so much, and they would be like, well, I do it this way, and I'd be like, well, clearly I have to do it that way because that's what the successful people are doing. And then I just realized that, like anything else, you have to just do what's best for you, and it takes a while to figure out what that is. And again, like, you have to be willing to change as you progress. Like, I think that's a hard one to grasp, because you're like, why am I not able to do what I did, one or two projects ago? But I like to think that it's like your whole thing as a writer is evolving. Like, you don't necessarily have the same process because maybe your skill set has changed a little bit.
Yeah, that makes
Cool.
perfect sense. And I know writers that I've talked to who've done, 25 books like Doug, and they say every time when they sit down and they're staring at that blank page, it doesn't get any easier. And so becoming a writer is, you got to be ready for, a more challenging journey for sure.
It's always that 40,000 word panic. It
Oh
doesn't
God,
matter
yeah.
how the story's going, you get to that because that's kind of where the story starts making the turn,
Yep.
where it goes from passive to active, and you get to that midpoint thing, and it's kind of like, this isn't working, it's awful, it's terrible, and I don't know what I'm doing, and I'm a fraud, and yada yada.
Oh God, yeah.
And the
I've
only
hit that.
benefit I always say is when you're 15, 20 books into it, you just say, shut up, idiot. You do this every time. Just keep writing. So,
Well, that's really good to hear that
yeah.
even 20 books in, you just push through
It
that
never goes away. And I know authors that have written 200 books that say the same thing. So yeah, it's just part of the beast.
Yeah, yeah. Ugh.
So talk to us about the new book that you have out.
Yes. We're
Yeah, so
curious.
Beneath the Poet's House. So it is set at 88 Benefit Street, which is in Providence, Rhode Island. And back in the sort of early to mid 1800s, 88 Benefit Street was the home of Sarah Helen Whitman, and it's where she was
Mm.
living when she was being courted by Edgar Allan Poe. So the book is modern day. It is a modern day thriller that is sort of inspired by the relationship between Poe and Whitman, and it's sort of a residual haunting stemming from their relationship. So the main character, Saoirse White, moves into 88 Benefit Street, and the more she comes to know about the house's history and previous inhabitant, the more she realizes that there are strange parallels between her life and a new man that she has started seeing, and the lives of Sarah Helen Whitman and Edgar Allan Poe.
Oh, very cool.
Wow.
Read this. Yeah. Wow. So where do you get your inspiration from?
Everywhere, all different places. So I think the biggest place that I get my inspiration from is rich settings, potentially historical settings. And for the last couple books, it's been in Rhode Island. And I think that's just by virtue of the fact that I live here and I love being able to do, hands-on research. And I love writing about Rhode Island because, I mean, there is kind of like anywhere that there's like a vibe to, being from here. And there's sort of this like, it's like on the most simplest of terms, it's like write what you know, but with the setting and just like having grown up here, I did move away for a number of years, but being back, it just sort of like brought back all of that like knowledge that I had about this place. Um, so yeah, so when I wrote my first novel, The Daughters of Block Island, I set that on Block Island at a historic kind of Gothic mansion that was built in the late 1800s, and it had burned down in the mid 1900s. But I was like, oh, I'm going to just resurrect this wonderfully amazing and creepy and interesting place for the setting of my novel. And then similarly with Beneath the Poet's House, I kind of had an idea that I wanted to write something inspired by Poe and Whitman. And then when I went to the house on 88 Benefit Street and walked, the streets and walked from the cemetery behind her house, past the cathedral, through what was the rose garden that she was standing in when Poe first saw her, down Benefit Street, which is also home of the shunned house of H.P. Lovecraft's eponymous tale. So those who are into Lovecraft lore, there's some fun Lovecraft Easter eggs in the book. And then all the way down Benefit Street, past Brown University's campus, to the Athenaeum, which is this beautiful old academic library where Poe and Whitman would literally sit in the alcoves of this library and he would like read Byron to her and like they would, flirt. And it just was so cool to walk these spaces where these famous literary figures had lived, significant portions of their lives. Because interestingly, though Poe and Whitman were only in each other's lives a short period of time, they were supposed to be married. And Whitman's only prerequisite to the marriage was that Poe stay sober. So we all know how that turned out for poor
Yeah.
Poe. So she broke up with him like a few days before their wedding, but they remained important to one another throughout. She is actually the one that we have to credit for sort of turning the tide on his negative reputation after he died. He had a literary rival that wrote this scathing obituary of him that had a lot of falsehood to it. And she actually, can you see? Yeah, it's like just cut off in the camera behind me. There's a book, Poe's Helen Remembers, and it's letters that Sarah Helen Whitman wrote to a later Poe biographer that helped clear up a lot of misconceptions about him. And she was a huge admirer of his work and a wonderful poet and literary critic and spiritualist and just a really interesting character herself. So it just was so cool that these two people that just were kind of larger than life in many regards, that you can walk in their exact footsteps where they were. So long answer to your question, but that of course was, I said, so I'm going to write this book and this is the setting. Like it has to take place on these streets at this house because you can practically feel the echoes of them still reverberating.
Oh, I love that. And often when I go on vacation, I will read a book that's set in the place because you know the background has to be accurate, right? I love historicals anyway. But so anybody going to Rhode Island, you need to read this book. Actually, both of our books, yeah, because it just gives you a different perspective, you know, when you bring people to life like that. Wow.
Yeah, and there are afterwards in both of my books that explain a little bit of that inspiration and also like what's fact and where I took some liberties. Because technically I write thrillers with like historical bents and not necessarily historical fiction, so I like to include the afterward to kind of show the differences between the two.
Oh,
Well, I think the take-home message from what you said, and I think this is for writers, and actually I'm doing in a few weeks a class for our Outliers Writing University on setting and setting as character, is that you talked more about the feel and the mood of the place than the actual physical structure. And I think that's the key to setting. It comes through the characters. It has a feel, it has a mood, it has a smell and a taste and a sound. It has all of that stuff. And that's what makes settings so cool and why they're so important to stories. And boy, it sounds like you've done your research and know your area. And I love the whole Poe Whitman thing. I mean, that's just fantastic. Fantastic stuff.
You.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what you just said is like why I like to write about Rhode Island because that and I mean I'm sure there are better writers than me that can capture that mood of a place when they haven't been there, but I just not only do I think it is easier, but I think it's a lot more fun to write that, you know, that feeling, that atmosphere, that mood when it's something that you know firsthand, or you at least can, you know, get a pretty good
it's a great
approximation
cover.
of.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, and I love the cover here, and it's so cool, and it's so gothic and so Poe-ish and
thank you.
all that.
The bottom right corner is actually a real portrait of Sarah Helen Whitman, which I thought was so cool that they could do.
That's great. Yeah.
And it also points out that you won a Bram Stoker Award, which I think is fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
That's a huge feather in the cap. Yep.
Oh, thanks so much.
So, Christa, tell our viewers where they can find out more about you and where they can get your books.
Yeah, so my website is mostly up to date. I might have a little pruning to do and additions to make, but my website is www.christacarmen.com. There are links to all of my social media right on the homepage. There are also links to my 2 novels. I do have a short story collection as well that I put out with an independent publisher several years back. So that's available from my website as well. And so, yeah, I think the website is probably ground zero for getting to the social media, which might have slightly more up-to-date, you know, events that kind of pop up as well. So, yeah.
And we can get your books wherever books are sold, I'm assuming.
Wherever books are sold and on Amazon. And yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. Well, you're a fantastic interview. This has been really terrific and a lot of great nuggets there for new writers. So thank you so much for being with us. And we're going to have you back on when your next book comes out.
Oh, that would be lovely.
Really enjoyed this. And I want to ask our viewers to please click the thumbs up. It helps with the algorithm to get these interviews out to the public. And if you like what we're doing here, please subscribe. It's free. And boy, I'm going to throw it back to you, Doug. This has been a fantastic interview.
Yeah, Christa, this has been fantastic. It's so insightful. I'd like your insights on writing and storytelling. You've just been wonderful. Everybody go buy Beneath the Poet's House. It's a wonderful book, and you'll enjoy it, and you'll get to know all about Rhode Island. I mean, you know, pretty cool. And Poe and Whitman and, you know, all that stuff. So that concludes this episode of Get to Know here on our Outliers YouTube channel. And as you know, we will be back with other interviews before too long. So until then, keep reading, keep writing, and keep having fun because, well, that's what it's all about. Bye-bye.